lot of questions here at the museum. Is the bay sick? What's wrong with the water? Is it polluted? And they want a baseline of comparison. Because you have to ask yourself, if the bay's dirty, when was it healthy? Was that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? When John Smith sailed through the Chesapeake and wrote about his experiences, there were so many oysters in the bay that they could have filtered the bay's water, all of it, in one day.
That's 18 trillion gallons of water. And so the water was crystal clear. You could see the bottom 40 feet down. But now, because of diseases and because of this historic overharvesting and
the oyster harvest not only took oysters out of the water, what it was also doing was pulling the bay's natural filter from the water. And what you see happening is a serious problem in terms of pollution in the bay.
The bay's issue is complex because it's a watershed of more than 65,000 square miles. So it extends everywhere from northern Virginia all the way up to middle of New York, near Cooperstown, New York, as a matter of fact.
And, you know, for a long time, there were no problems simply because the Chesapeake had evolved so well to clean itself. Oysters are the bay's most efficient filters. They can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day, which is really significant. And especially in terms of looking at the bay's problems, they are a natural solution. Now, we didn't always know that, or we didn't really even think about it until we saw what we had done.
The fact that there are now 17 million of us living in the watershed create a situation where there's only 1% of that historic population of oysters left. And so that's one of the reasons why the bay is in such terrible condition. And a lot of people don't realize that our sewage treatment plants are really quite primitive. And every time it rains, most of them overflow and send raw sewage straight into some tributary of the Chesapeake Bay.
Not to mince words, the problem with the bay is excrement. The bay's balance is off, and that's because more than ever before there's more nitrogen in the bay. And the more people, the more of it there is.
And if you think about the big picture in those simple terms, if we put less bad stuff in the bay and took fewer good things out of the bay, then the bay would probably be in better shape than it is.
But oysters have an impact on the bay situation in that they can be a big solution.
But the overall impact is that we haven't done enough to help restore the bay in the time that I've been here. And that's frustrating, and sometimes it can be discouraging.
They're really simple. They're just essentially two rakes stuck together on poles. So you lower your oyster tongs down, and then you're gonna just open and close it in sort of like a scissor-like motion to get your pile together. And then you're gonna raise that up. What you can see here is that I don't actually have a lot of living oysters. In fact, most of my oysters are dead. And you can tell looking at them because there's only a half a shell. A living oyster is completely closed, very tightly closed. It's difficult to find anything that's alive. Besides some bottom dwellers, it doesn't look like I've got any living catch at all. This is what it's like harvesting oysters nowadays. You're really lucky to find live oysters. So you used to have to break apart the live ones to sell them individually. Now you have to find the live ones among a pile of the dead ones.
Oyster tonging is slow. It's slow work, it's backbreaking work, but you didn't have to go fast because your oysters were going to spoil. You couldn't send them anywhere. And so they had to be sold to an immediate market in the local area. So they were a delicacy that was located only in the Chesapeake. They were something you could only get here or where, you know, along the water. But what changed in the 19th century is you have all this new technology coming out of the Industrial Revolution. So you've got, you know, the steam locomotive, you have canning and preserving, and you have the dredge. And the dredge doesn't look like a technological innovation, but it definitely was at the time period. Attached to a large boat, it was an incredibly efficient oyster machine. You know, it could just harvest a huge amount of oysters in a very short time period compared to tonging, where you've got one guy in a boat, you know, picking up the oysters off the bottom. With these dredges, canning, and with the trains, you had the ability to harvest more than ever, to preserve and package more than ever, and to send them further away than ever before. And people were hungry for that.
New England oystermen came down in their schooners with their new dredges and decimated the oyster population here.
Oysters are delicious. And that's part of the problem, is that, and you see this, it's a trend. I mean, any animal that's delicious is gonna have its days numbered in terms of like how long they're gonna last, because humans will devour them. And that's absolutely what happened in the 19th century. They became like a fad food. Everyone would make, you know, oyster stew and oyster soup and oyster fritters, and you look in these receipt books from the 19th century, and it's just oysters, oysters, oysters. You know, they cooked so many of them, they used them in so many dishes, they would cook them and then throw the oysters away and just use them for the broth. I mean, there again, it's this mentality like there was never going to be any end to these oysters. Very quickly, within 40 years of the oyster harvest opening to dredging, from 1860 to 1880 is really the peak of the oystering harvest. And then by the very end of the 19th century, you see a very steep decline very quickly. And what they found is they just hit the tipping point. The oysters weren't able to reproduce quickly enough to keep up with the oyster harvest. The oysters have never recovered. And that's because the pressure from the harvest has never decreased. There are photographs from these towns at the end of the oystering season, and the piles of oyster shells are 4 or 5 stories high. Huge amounts of oysters every day were harvested. That doesn't last forever. That type of harvest doesn't last forever. But they weren't thinking in terms of the next 80 years. They were thinking in terms of, you know, I'm paying bills next week.
What is wonderful about the Bay is just how inspirational it is. There are still sections of the Bay that haven't changed since before John Smith showed up. It is just a beautiful playground for all sorts of recreation. It's important that we keep our ties with our history and with our heritage. We can't really appreciate the Bay as it is now unless we understand everything that's happened over the centuries.
Just by being informed, people who come here to the museum can make a more informed decision. And that's what I try to do, is I try to teach people that there's a lot more to oysters than just food. You know, when you eat an oyster from the Chesapeake Bay, you are eating all that history, all that tradition, 400 years of a connection with an animal, and thousands of years of a connection with an animal if you look back to the relationship that the Indians had with it. We have made a huge impact on the Bay. I mean, oysters are just one solution, but there's going to have to be a lot of change that accompanies that to ensure that we even have the Bay the way it is now for our children.